Hello everyone, I'm Troy Dodds and welcome to the On The Record podcast presented by The Western Weekender. On this podcast I'm joined by special guests who all have such great stories to tell about Penrith and the role they've played in our city. They are Penrith stories told by Penrith's people. Today my special guest is Marise Payne, a former coalition government minister. Marise served as a federal senator from 1997 until 2023, becoming the longest serving female senator in Australia's history. She had an extraordinary career in politics and that took her around the world, not for glorious holidays, but for some of the most defining moments in history. Marise, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Troy. Great to see you.
First question we always ask, where and when we were born, where did you grow up?
I grew up in a combination of the St George area of Sydney, which accounts for what Penrith people might think is my appalling taste in football teams, and the New South Wales Southern Highlands, so a little suburb called Bardwell Park, and the Southern Highlands, where my father was originally from.
Okay, and what were your parents like? What was childhood like for you?
Idyllic. Fabulous. I'm really privileged and lucky to be able to say that. I was in a small but loving family, just one sibling, my younger brother, and my parents were totally committed to doing everything they possibly could for their children. My father worked his tail off to become a very successful business person. He was a World War II veteran, and married my mother later in life, and we were incredibly lucky to be able to share that time between the city and the Southern Highlands. I think that really gave me my appreciation for rural and regional Australia as well. I love our farm. It's still there between my brother and me. Both my parents have passed, but we still have a property that we share in the Southern Highlands, and it's one of my special places, I guess you would say.
You mentioned your dad in business, so what business was he?
He was a chartered accountant.
Okay.
He was highly competent financially and numerically, not skills I inherited. I like to think I'm okay with words, but not so great with numbers.
Yep.
And he made his way through business in Australia and was a chartered accountant in his own practice for a long time.
And given where you ended up, were your parents particularly political?
No. He was, I think, very conscious of Australia's place in the world, in particular following his World War II service. So he served in then New Guinea and in New Caledonia. And I think that gave him an acute appreciation for Australia's place in the world. Fair to say, though, they were both certainly Liberal voters my whole life. I never got any idea that they'd voted any other way. And
for you, was there any sort of impact on you from them, or where did your first sort of political inclination come from that you were keen on the world of politics?
I think my father was very influential on my decisions. I decided to study law, and I did, and he encouraged discussion and debate, not in a party political way, but in a current affairs way. And I was passionate about debating at school and at university, which is probably a bit tragic at this stage. Passionate about it, though. I really enjoyed it, enjoyed that contest of ideas and the competition itself, I guess. But it morphed into an interest in politics, and I joined the Liberal Party.
Yeah, well, you mentioned uni. You obviously went to the University of New South Wales and joined the Young Liberals around this time as well. Some kids, I guess, sort of, trend against their parents. Was it always the Liberal Party for you and those values? And what drew you towards the Liberal Party?
I think that's where my philosophical grounding is in terms of the values of the Liberal Party, of freedom, of equality of opportunity, the free market, pursuit of justice, and those sorts of issues. But ultimately, there was never any other option for me, and in fact, it was a natural inclination of mine, and I think my father probably watched. Not concerned that I would go elsewhere, I don't think, but watched with interest to see what would happen. He had political friends in his life. He knew Tom Lewis, which is going back a long way, he knew Eric Willis, who was briefly the Liberal Premier of New South Wales. But I think the reason he knew Eric Willis was because he lived in Bardwell Park, not because he was politically connected.
You also become the first female president of the Young Liberals. So was leadership something that was in your blood from pretty early on? You mentioned debating and whatnot. Obviously, you had the confidence levels, but was leadership something that you sort of sought out?
I suppose the answer to that has to be yes. It doesn't happen by accident, right?
Sure.
But not in a way that was sort of do or die. I was very fortunate to become the president of the New South Wales Young Liberals first, not the first woman to do that, but ultimately the first female federal president of the Young Liberals. I'm happy to say there have been others since, but there can always be more, and I certainly have worked very hard over the years to encourage that. I think in leadership terms, I was happy to work. I'm always happy to work within a team, within a system. And if the opportunity arises that you need to do a job, then I'm happy to do that job.
You mentioned there, and it's littered through your career, first woman to do this, first woman to do that. When you were picking up these roles earlier on, was that something that you were made aware of, or is it sort of looking back to you, I was the first woman to do that, or was it along the way you sort of told this, that you're the first woman to do it? Did you face challenges in that regard as well?
There's certainly challenges every step of the way. Not particularly conscious of it. I remember being told after I was appointed to chair the Parliament's Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade, which is a pretty important committee in the context of the Parliament, that I was the first woman to do that. That was rather unceremoniously interrupted by an election which the Liberal Party lost, the coalition lost. But it hadn't occurred to me at the time that I was going to be the first woman to do that. In the Young Liberal movement, it was graphically clear that there had not been female leaders where there should have been. And so I was very keen to have that opportunity to put some balance into that as well.
You graduated uni with law and arts degrees, so two degrees. Yes. There. Didn't finish uni though before you were involved in a pretty serious car accident. Do you have memories of that, and tell us what happened there?
I have acute memories of that. I was a passenger in a car that had an accident coming back from the snow, actually, at the time. And I was very badly injured. Fortunately, the driver was not, but I broke my neck in that car accident. Wow. It was, for a teenage girl, it was a very confronting experience. For my family, it was a very confronting experience. But ultimately, I thank all of our deities every day that I am able to walk, because many people who've suffered the same injury are not, and B, alive. So it was, for me, a bit of an early epiphany. I'm not sure how many people in their teens experience epiphanies, but I did. And I had gone to university with every intention of being qualified as a lawyer, probably becoming a barrister. I thought I might be able to hold my own on the courtroom floor. But coming that close to a really tragic outcome made me think that you don't get too many second chances in life. And it was really difficult. I remember it was my brother's HSC year, and it was awful for him. It really disrupted our family and our lives. I couldn't drive myself. I couldn't dress myself. I was wearing a body brace, which was under my chin, into my head, over my shoulders, with a breastplate and strapping around my body to keep my neck in place. It was the year Australia won the America's Cup.
Okay.
And my family forgot me that morning and left me in bed while they all watched the win, because I couldn't get out myself. I don't think they really forgot. I think it just didn't work. But it was a very difficult time. And I relied a lot on my mother, who was able to take me to and from university every day that I needed to be there. And pushed through, but it made me think, as I said, you don't get too many second chances in life, really. And if you want to do something, then probably best to go for it in case the worst happens.
Yeah, pretty extraordinary. Obviously a long recovery.
Yes, many months.
But as you say, it does sort of point you in the direction, ironically, of where you wanted to go. Tell us about, if we fast forward, I know you get appointed to the Senate in 1997, but the journey to that, and sort of fighting your way through the various inclinations of politics and sort of getting that appointment. What ensued post uni and getting yourself into the political world?
I was really lucky to have some very valuable and strong mentors. People like John Fay in particular, who I was working with John when my father passed away, and I remember the day I went to tell my chief of staff, John's office, that my father had died. He said, I thought not very empathetically at the time, that's okay, you'll always have a father in life while John Fay's here. And that was actually the day my own father had died. And it was a harsh, I thought, observation at the time, but in the end it turned out to be true. And John and another former employer, then Senator Robert Hill, who was our shadow foreign minister at the time, but became our environment minister, our defence minister in the Howard government. They were both amazing mentors for me. And then a range of women like Patricia Forsyth and Chris McDivan, Robin Parker from the Liberal Party, who were all presidents and leaders through the party of our Women's Council, or Patricia was in Parliament. They mentored me, saw whatever potential there was there, and that made a huge difference. I don't think you can do it by yourself. So active in the Young Liberal movement, then active in the senior party, on the party's state executive, and also very strongly supported in my career. I chose to work in politics after that car accident, not to practice law, and I worked, as I said, with John and with Robert Hill. I worked with John twice, when he was Minister for Industrial Relations and again when he was Premier, and so they are really valuable parts of my story, which made a huge difference.
And what about being appointed to the Senate in 1997, that process and how that unfolded?
I had run for pre-selection unsuccessfully a couple of times before that. I like to think of it as character building, that experience.
Always for the Senate?
Yes, always for the Senate. I didn't have an interest in the House of Representatives. I don't know whether I would have been good at it or not, but I didn't have an interest in the House of Representatives. And so I ran for the Senate when a casual vacancy arose. And you know, it's somewhat ironic given how things have changed in a cultural sense, in workplaces and politically. The vacancy arose because the incumbent had been having an extramarital relationship with a staffer.
Right.
From someone else's office.
Okay.
And it was exposed, and ultimately he stepped aside, and I filled that vacancy. And I was very grateful for the support of the Liberal Party, but also conscious, because I knew the woman involved, also conscious of the human cost that came at the time. But I remember Barry O'Farrell ringing me at that point and saying, okay, he's about to resign, there's going to be a vacancy, you have to run. And I did.
And you were successful, of
I
course.
was.
And kicked off a very long political career in 1997. When you got to Canberra, you settle into the routine of it all, obviously, and we really only see a glimpse of it every couple of hours through the day. Is there something that surprised you most when you arrived there and got into the swing of things? Was there something you didn't expect early on?
I think that I was fortunate that having worked in the system and having worked in Canberra for a period, particularly for Robert Hill, I actually worked in my very first job in Canberra in Old Parliament House, which will give everybody an idea of how old I am, for Andrew Peacock for a period, which was pretty exciting as well. And he was another great mentor. So I kind of knew how it worked. And I used to say, after I had been there for a couple of years, that I knew how good it could be, but I'm not sure I had an appreciation of the depth of some of the challenges and how hard the hard parts could be. So I guess I learnt that through actually ending up there myself in 1997.
To that point, I guess one of the difficulties, and it doesn't just happen in politics, it happens in a lot of industries, is just people's perception of how politics works and the day-to-day elements, and often that time maybe in the chamber, they in their minds, I guess, is the only part of your working day. But I guess you start to realise pretty early on that it's a pretty full-on commitment.
Oh, it most certainly is. And I think for federal parliamentarians, going from Sydney/New South Wales is a walk in the park compared to coming from far north Queensland or the Territory or the West, even Tasmania. I mean, the change in flight schedules and things like that literally changes their entire family and life routines. So I'm pretty lucky that I was only ever going from Sydney to Canberra in that context. But it is a full-time, comprehensive commitment to your role, and you can make your own fortunes to a degree by working incredibly hard and being willing to do anything. I remember being asked to do a particular job. I was asked by John Anderson, when he was the Transport Minister, to chair the Sydney Airport Community Forum. Okay. Ironic, seeing as I ended up on the forum on Western Sydney Airport later on. And I didn't really want to do that. I mean, it was a hiding to nothing, frankly. And I remember telling Robert Hill that this is a terrible job. I don't want to do this, really. And he said, if you don't do the terrible jobs, you'll never get a good job. And he was right. So I cheerfully chaired the Sydney Airport Community Forum for a while. So that was managing, aircraft noise in the city. At the time, it was really contentious. So I did that for a while as well. So I think it is absolutely right to say that the way politics and the parliaments are portrayed in the Australian media, particularly, and the mainstream media at that, means that people only ever see conflict. And I think that's a real shame. If you don't go to Canberra in 6th grade as part of the school excursion process, where you can, in our beautiful parliament, you can sit in those galleries for the students and you can watch the whole proceedings of the day at any given point. And you can see that people are not always in conflict. They're not always yelling and shouting. There's often, excess agreement. Everybody agrees. And I don't think you'll ever see a front page of a Fairfax newspaper which says in shock news today the opposition and the government agreed on a landmark piece of legislation. It's just not interesting. But it should be sometimes, because it's for the betterment of Australia.
Absolutely. This time, of course, John Howard is Prime Minister, the beginning of a long reign as PM. Tell me about working with him, and am I right to say it wasn't always the best relationship?
It's a funny story in its own way, I suppose. We both started some decades apart, literally in the same branch of the Young Liberal movement, in Elwood Young Liberals. So that's kind of nice to have. We're both huge Dragons fans. That's nice to have. But, to be fair, I went into the Parliament as the Deputy Chair of the Australian Republican movement at the time. That was not his favourite thing in the world. Sure. And I had been a very outspoken and assertive young Liberal in policy terms, and member of the party state executive. So I'm not sure he knew what he would get when I turned into a senator. We have an excellent relationship these days, and I admire him enormously and respect him greatly. But it is true to say that under his leadership, I certainly wasn't promoted, and had to make my own way. And I did that through really hard yards on committee work in the Senate, on our Legal and Constitutional Committee, including, for example, the legislation that Australia enacted in response to 9/11, on our Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Committee in the Senate, and then on our Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade for years. So that was the pathway that I took. After we lost in 2007 and Mr. Howard lost his seat, I think, I realised long before then, but it certainly cemented in my mind that his particular brand of leadership in the party was immensely powerful. As we went to the first party meeting after that 2007 loss, one of my former colleagues, the late Senator Professor Russell Trude, slapped me on the back and said, "So, how does this work?" And I said, "I have no idea. I've only ever known John Howard as leader." So we were all off to an adventure, really, in that way. And that period between 2007, that election, and 2013 is not probably our finest moments in terms of leadership and stability.
You mentioned, and not alone there, as we know.
Indeed.
John Howard, you mentioned, loses the 2007 election, and I'm interested. You've been in obviously now a couple of governments that have ultimately fallen and a couple that have formed. Do you get the feeling, like when do you get the feeling that you're in trouble here? You know, like you can read polls, you can do all of that. There's obviously a lot of internal polling and whatnot, but is there often a moment where you just go, we're just not going to win this? And in the context of 2007, did it feel like Kevin Rudd was just unstoppable?
I'd like to say no, but I think obviously some elections are much harder to win than others. But Australian elections in the federal context, so 1996 was a massive wave of support to John Howard. But most of the elections are marginal, not in the sense of the vote in each seat, but are small numbers of seats changing hands that change ultimately increase over the term of government to enable a full change of government to be made. In 2022, I thought that we could still win, and if you don't maintain that faith, actually, it's very hard to campaign. Very hard to campaign. And, you have great candidates on the ground, and then you have candidates who are hopeless and don't work. And, you think, actually, you're not made for politics, my friend, if this is the approach you take. In 2007, we all worked incredibly hard, and my position since 1997, so for a decade by then, was always focused on Western Sydney. My office was in Parramatta for 26 and a half years, and I'm immensely proud of that commitment to Western Sydney. I've worked with, since 1997, all of our local members and candidates here in Lindsay, and worked very hard with them along the way. And so in 2007, it was a genuine and real struggle. Now, we had our own events here in Lindsay connected with the Liberal Party in 2007, which most certainly didn't help.
Yeah, that was a difficult time, but out of difficulty sometimes comes opportunity, and in that same year you are appointed to the Shadow Ministry. So, as you mentioned, that there was certainly no promotion to the ministry under John Howard, but in 2007 you joined the Shadow Ministry. So tell me about that, and did that feel like I'm on a path here to...
That's a good question because, it's baby steps, right? So I think my first role in the Shadow Ministry was something called a Shadow Assistant Parliamentary Secretary. Now, it's harder to go beneath that, much harder to go beneath that than I had realised. And I was lucky, though, that the roles that at that very junior level I was given were in things that I was passionate about. I had quite different, but Indigenous employment and development for a period. I had a Shadow Assistant Parliamentary Secretary role for the Pacific and international development, and that was like a nascent opportunity in the foreign affairs space. Andrew Robb was the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs, and ultimately I was made the Shadow Minister for Housing by Tony Abbott, and that was a real opportunity to get your teeth into a real policy area where you could grapple with government policy. I think Tanya Plibersek was the Labor Housing Minister at the time. You could grapple with government policy and really articulate the case for why it was wrong or right, or why what we wanted to do was right. And that was a real opportunity for me. So I worked very hard at that. I know I ultimately shared that. I think Scott Morrison had that portfolio for a period as well. So, all really good opportunities, and particularly in Western Sydney. I mean, you can go anywhere in Western Sydney and talk about the challenges related to housing. So for me, that was great.
In the background around this time, you mentioned that there's some leadership issues within the coalition and the Liberals as well, but the whole Rudd-Gillard-Rudd drama is happening in the background of the next sort of 6 years. Did you just sit back at times and go, what the hell is going on here?
Often.
And is there... It's a difficult one, but from being in the opposition point of view, is there a little bit of like, well, I kind of like that they're tearing each other apart, or is it also, is the deeper thing, well, this is just not good for the country at all?
Well, there's a combination of things. Never interrupt your enemies when they're fighting amongst themselves. That's a very important thing. So don't do anything that might distract them from their own fight. But yes, of course, the concern that it's not great for the country, and it doesn't lend stability to the important systems of democracy that we all believe in as small d, Democrats in this nation. I'm reminded that it was the Penrith by-election result in 2010 that led some of the members of Parliament, Labor members of Parliament, senators in particular, who came to that by-election day to go back to Canberra and to say, this is over for us. We have to change leaders. So it was an acute message to receive from Western Sydney for those senators, and one of them actually, Don Farrell, referred to that in his response to my valedictory speech when I stepped down last year, which was quite funny, and in a jocular and warm way, and so. Watching that process unravel in terms of governments, it gives you a real incentive as an opposition as well, I must say, and drive to be better.
You mentioned 2010 by-election, of course, won by Stuart Ayres, who around this time becomes your partner as well. So what drew you to Stuart? And obviously two very career-focused people. Coming together. How did you make it work with that lingering in the background as well?
Well, it wasn't our football teams, I can tell you that. So I think two very politically oriented people with shared interests is probably the bottom line there. And Stuart was obviously a local Liberal here. Had worked on Lindsay campaigns for a long time, and I'd known him for a while. So. But most people say, oh my goodness, imagine putting two politicians in the same family. But in its own way, it is valuable to be able to share experiences that you both understand.
Who asked who out first?
I think he probably did.
He did? Okay. All right. We'll chalk that up to him. And you both, of course, go into probably your busiest decades individually. Yeah. So I think Stuart said this before, but there would have been years in there where you would have spent less than 30 or 40 nights at home together. Like pretty crazy.
Oh, that is 100% true. In 2019, before COVID, so I was Foreign Minister in 2019 and we had an election in 2019, I spent about 70 nights at home in the whole year. And that does not mean that he was there at the same time.
Yeah.
So he's probably right on that assessment. And that was an incredibly busy year, for example. And I was talking to some women in business around International Women's Day at the back end of last week, and somebody asked me about work-life balance. And I did actually say that you can't even think about that. As a cabinet minister, particularly a cabinet minister with international obligations like defence and foreign affairs. So we didn't really pursue work-life balance, but we tried our hardest to make sure that we were not starving our cats to death.
Yep.
And I owe him an enormous debt for his support of our household, while I spent a lot of time on the road.
2010 and 2013, of course, federal elections as well. You were quite heavily involved in both campaigns with Fiona Scott. 2010, very late to the party as a candidate. 2013, obviously successful there. You mentioned earlier, like, you're dealing with candidates often in their first throw of the dice in all of this. So how does that unfold? There's obviously a huge learning curve. You want them to be their own person, but the learning curve that must come with it, that you're there to help provide as well. Must be a tricky thing coordinating those campaigns, and they're not used to this crazy 6 weeks of relentless media and train stations and everything else you can squeeze into the day.
Well, let's start with the day. The day is 24 hours with about 40 hours of work in it. Yeah. And it is quite extraordinary for a candidate, and particularly for a new candidate. I think in Fiona's case, having run in 2010, the awareness was there, and that's really important. But you've got to come to the table with the work ethic and the team ethic, willingness to be part of a team. It's a directed process in terms of what your candidate is supposed to do every day, and whether that is the absolutely footsore, back-breaking experience of relentless door knocking, whether it is starting at your railway station or your bus terminus, and then functions in between, media appearances, the pressure of media appearances, because for new candidates and people who are not members, and even people who are experienced in some cases, the pressure of the media appearance, when it can turn the national debate in a second,
which we've seen here in
just
New Zealand
100% we have, is just enormous. And so making sure that the candidate is supported, working with your party organisation, and the Liberal Party has from time to time had offices in Western Sydney to support campaigning. I'm a huge advocate for that. I think it makes your candidates feel like the party cares, that it's grounded, excuse me, that we are here in number, and it might only be a small number. It can just be one coordinator, but it makes a difference to know that person is there and cares. So I'm a big advocate for that, and we've done that in High Street Penrith over the years. We've done it in Parramatta over the years. So doing that, but it is immensely difficult. And Australians, I think, they don't often give their politicians a break, and they probably shouldn't. We deserve to be treated very robustly. But at the same time, most politicians, the overwhelming majority, north of 95%, work so hard, so incredibly hard, and it doesn't ever stop. I mean, if you think about it, most people, most normal people, regular people in their regular jobs, can go to the end of their driveway and pick up a newspaper in the morning or collect the mail or whatever it is. That sounds very old-fashioned, doesn't it? Our newspapers are not on our driveways anymore, I suppose. But most people can do that. Politicians can't. You actually get to the end of your driveway and someone says, "Oi, what happened to the garbage collection this morning?"
Yeah.
You can't actually say, "I'm a federal politician" or "I'm a state politician, not really my job." You can't say that.
Or you're potentially on the front page of that newspaper as well.
Well, that's exactly right. And so, it's a very all-consuming job. But the balance to that is that we are all volunteers. None of us is a conscript. No one makes you become a politician.
Sure.
So you ask for it, right?
Tony Abbott wins the 2013 election. The Liberals return to power in Canberra, and you become Minister for Human Services. So tell me about being promoted to the ministry, being appointed as part of that Abbott ministry, and grabbing that role initially.
Well, Troy, it is a moment of immense pride to serve your country as a minister in any role, I think. And I was surprised to be appointed Human Services Minister, fair to say. I was as I said, Shadow Minister for Housing before the election. But Human Services was a great opportunity insofar as it was one of only two portflios outside the Cabinet that had its own department. There were 35,000 staff in the Human Services portfolio. So you go down to the end of High Street towards the river, everyone walks past our old Centrelink every day. Those people were on my team, part of my staff. I was their minister. And the same right around Australia. So managing the payment system that Australians depend on every single day, plus Medicare, plus looking after child support and Australian hearing, all of those things are immensely important. And frankly, most Australians are in touch with what is now Services Australia at very difficult times in their lives. And you have to be acutely aware of that.
Tell me about a bit of inside baseball, I guess, that people might be interested in terms of setting up an office. Do you pick every employee yourself, every media advisor, every staffer? How does all
ministerial
of that
office
work?
Yes. Yes, very much so. Although there is a process by which people are interested in working for a government of whatever colour it is at the time, Labor or Liberal. They usually make their interest known through a central process, and so often there'll be a list of names that you can look at.
Yeah.
I went to, in my case, in the first instance, I went to former ministers and asked advice of people they knew who'd worked in the system before, because I knew I was new.
Yeah.
Completely new. I'd never done this before. As a shadow minister, I didn't have any extra staff. I used my own electorate staff largely, and I asked other ministers who had been part of the Howard government what their experience was and if they knew people. That's actually how I found my first chief of staff, and she was exceptional. absolutely exceptional. A public servant by background, but one who was willing to work in the system. And then for the rest of the staff, they have to be approved through a central process at the senior advisor and advisor level, at the media advisor level. So it's a recruitment process that you can manage. But if you chose someone that was, for whatever reason, and I've never had this experience, so I don't really know where they draw the lines, but for whatever reason was not someone that the system thought was going to be a right fit, you might have to answer a few questions on that. And you get checked out through the process, how you're performing, how your office is performing, and you basically have to operate on a traffic light system. What's green, what's amber, what's red. Red's a problem, and your staff are in the same space. If you get too many reds, then you're in trouble at the ministry meeting.
Yeah. Okay. Now, of course, Tony Abbott ultimately gets rolled. We've all seen the recent ABC documentary, which you did feature in, but not much. So I'm guessing you didn't give them all that much in terms of content.
Maybe I'm not very interesting
compared to others. But tell me about this for you during this time, a difficult period, I'm guessing, as Abbott's leadership ultimately crumbled.
Well, first of all, I didn't watch Nemesis. I feel like I lived it, so I didn't really need to watch it so much. But I did get occasional texts from people saying, "That was interesting what you just said on Nemesis." Yes, it is. It is a very difficult time for a government and for a political party, frankly, and it's intensely personal. There are always relationships between people that are impacted, and of course the relationship of everybody with the leader who's being challenged and the leader who's coming in is impacted as well. So it's not something I would wish on my worst enemy, frankly, but it happens. I don't think it's ideal, but the dynamics in politics are pretty tough. And you have to make sure you're meeting the probably nebulous KPIs that your party room expects of you. I think every leader who's been forced out of office would say they were meeting those KPIs and the party room was unreasonable, or the caucus in Labor's sense was unreasonable. But would I ever wish it upon us again? No.
Yeah, a difficult time, and obviously we'd spoken about that Labor had just been through it, so
yes.
for the Liberals to be putting themselves through it as well
yes.
was pretty chaotic. But again, opportunity arises. Malcolm Turnbull ultimately appoints you Defence Minister. Now, not that Human Services isn't a pretty critical portfolio that you mentioned, but it's kind of, we're stepping up a gear here.
We're most certainly stepping up a gear, and you go from having 35,000 people depending on your leadership to having 80,000 people, including all of Australia's women and men in uniform, depending on you. And there is, in my view, no greater honour in ministerial terms than being Australia's Defence Minister and to lead the women and men who choose to put on the uniform of the Army or the Royal Australian Navy or the Royal Australian Air Force. So it is something which weighed on me greatly at the time. I think I said a bit earlier when we were talking about my family that my father was a World War II veteran, and I'm immensely proud of his army service in the Second World War. And it certainly was part of our awareness and our family life growing up. We were always aware of Dad's service. And finding myself in that position, and him having passed away in 1994 meant that he didn't get to see any of that, which was a little sad for me. But my mother had also passed away by then, so it was. I like to think they're looking, but it was a matter of great pride. Some trepidation. My new department secretary, well known to the public sector in Australia, Dennis Richardson, former head of ASIO and other agencies, ambassador to the US, he said, "So, Minister, this is going to be like drinking from an operating fire hose." I said, "Fabulous. Well, I'm ready." And I was ready, I think. I had worked in the area of defence and foreign affairs for well over a decade in my work in the Senate and the Parliament. I was passionate about it, and passionate about, like my father, Australia's position in the world. this was a real opportunity for me to lead in that role. We did some exceptional things. We restarted Australia's shipbuilding program in a way that had fallen away very, very badly under previous governments. And for our own industrial capacity and for our own military capability, that was essential. The portfolio was split by Prime Minister Turnbull after the 2016 election into defence, which was me, and defence industry. I think it's a hard split to make at the cabinet level, but we made it work, and we commissioned some really important procurements, including combat reconnaissance vehicles, bringing the F-35 into operation in Australia. Going to the Avalon Air Show is, if you're either an aircraft nerd or a defence nerd, the Avalon Air Show in Geelong is the place to be. Seeing those first F-35 fighter jets land in Australia is like nothing else.
Yeah. What about challenges and difficult moments in that portfolio?
Well, the challenges are huge, and it is one of the 24-hour cabinet roles, no question. I think the most difficult moments are going to be in two areas. They're always going to be any question that Australia as a nation may be involved in conflict. And then the other challenge is when you lose a service member, either in an operational context or in training, or in any way really, and the engagement with families, with their mates with whom they've served, it's as close to personal tragedy as it gets, I think, in a workplace environment. We had a terrible training accident during my time as Defence Minister, where a young man was shot and killed by accident. I thought of this a lot in the last week, where my former Defence Minister colleague from the Labor Party, Joel Fitzgibbon, lost his son in a training accident. I mean, the horror and the tragedy is unspeakable. So you're very acutely conscious of that. There are funny moments, it's fair to say, because Australia's soldiers, sailors and Air Force members are capable of doing some pretty silly things from time to time. But overwhelmingly, it's a deadly serious job with deadly serious outcomes if it doesn't go right.
Talking of serious jobs, of course, a couple of years later in 2018, you become the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and I find this one interesting because I think from a general day-to-day observer, it doesn't really follow politics that much. If you ask them what that portfolio would involve, I don't know what they'd say. Maybe they'd say you dress up in some odd outfits at the odd conference here and there, and you stay tuned to what's happening overseas. But it is a far deeper and far more critical role, and I probably didn't even have a full insight into it until you spoke at another function that I was at a little while ago. This is pretty critical, world-defining stuff at different times. Tell us about some of the experiences there. I know that a lot was happening in Afghanistan around the time that you were appointed as well, and the evacuations there.
I think your observation about the criticality of the role is 100% on the money. There's no question of that. And much like defence, where every single day I acknowledged and thanked the women and men of the ADF for their service and their families as well. We ask a lot of our diplomats too. We don't always think about that. In fact, the word diplomat, I'm not sure, lends itself to a real understanding of what we ask those people to do.
Sure.
And so from one end of the world to the other, wherever Australia has representation, our job is to advocate on Australia's behalf, but also to advocate on the values and the principles that we hold as a Western democracy in terms of global issues. It is hugely complex, and I think I was fortunate to have some appreciation of that for two reasons. One, because of the committee work I had done over many, many years, but also because I had sat around the National Security Committee table as Defence Minister and been able to see the work of my predecessor, the extremely highly regarded Julie Bishop, in the role. It was there was so many things. I can't count them. I mean, if you think about 2018, what the DPRK was doing in relation to South Korea, the pressure that they were placing on South Korea and within the region in terms of the use of missiles, threats, the engagement that China had in that, our role as a very close partner in the region. Our role to support the UN sanctions process there. I was in Seoul. I saw the depth of despair that South Koreans were living under because of those threats. The challenges of authoritarian states in many incarnations, Iran, Russia, North Korea, China, all of those. Australians being arbitrarily detained around the world, and that happened in multiple places, including in Iran, including in China. Is a very difficult and delicate task for a foreign minister to manage. Dealing with consular disasters, I think we've seen many of those over the years, and the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade has, unfortunately, but I'm complimenting them in saying, really grown that skill base over a long period of time. But the explosion of the White Island, the Whangarei volcano in New Zealand, where Australians were killed, injured beyond recognition, were urgently transported to burns hospitals here in Sydney at the time. It's unspeakable what you have to do with families then. And our High Commissioner and our Consul General in Auckland at the time, that was Patricia Forsyth and Craig Knowles, both actually former politicians. They ran their teams exceptionally to support those people. I remember our ambassador in Iran and the support she gave to Kylie Moore-Gilbert when she was imprisoned there. The support we've had to give and keep giving, unfortunately, to Yang Hengjun in China. And then there's all of the intricacies of international diplomacy, the multilateral system, managing through the UN, working with really important entities like the Pacific Island Forum and ASEAN. I've just seen ASEAN here in Australia. All of that is literally 24/7. And I want you to add a 2-year global pandemic to that challenge.
Absolutely.
When you can't leave your country as foreign minister, it's a bit odd.
And so much unpredictability, I guess. You know, in every other portfolio, you probably, in a lot of cases, have the opportunity to plan for weeks and months about this particular thing is going to happen and we're going to budget for this and we need to plan for this. But you know, an accident on a global scale or a major incident in a country or an Australian being detained somewhere in the world, you often don't have warning that that's about to happen.
Oh, that's absolutely right. And even if you have a plan, for example, you have a plan for a particular global meeting, the agenda is X, your attendance is required, so you plan to be there, you plan to work with partner nations to achieve an outcome. Only one nation needs to change their mind and either not turn up or not participate. And it's happened before, really has. And you have an instantaneous crisis on your hands. The other interesting part is about making sure that, you know, Australians and like-minded countries are well represented in the international agencies so that we have a voice. So whether that's the UN agencies or more broadly, and making sure that we can either support other candidates who reflect what we want to see in leadership terms or support our own candidates. You run mini election campaigns for those people all the time. And then the crisis side of it. The Afghanistan evacuation is a very good example of that. The crisis side of it is next level. The Afghanistan evacuation occupied 24 hours of every 24-hour day. You have to operate on that cycle because we were flying people out of Kabul into the UAE. The word chaos, it doesn't even begin to describe what was happening around the airport. I had one of my staff who was literally communicating with Afghani soldiers who'd been trained at Duntroon in Canberra on the ground who were communicating to US Marines at the gates of Kabul airport to identify a family group who were waving a coloured scarf. And literally out of my office, that message was being conveyed across mobile phones. Thank God for the mobile phone system. And what colour is the scarf, the Marines are saying? Is it yellow or is it yellowy orange? We've got this, because it was happening everywhere. We thought we could, when we started that process, we thought we could bring 900 people out of Afghanistan. 4,000 people came out on Australian ADF flights. It was a tour de force by the ADF, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the Department of Home Affairs. And, our staff, my then DFAT staff, were on the concrete in Kabul airport trying to catch a couple of hours rest before the next round of flights. I was convinced women were going to give birth on planes. Yeah. We had new babies just born. We had babies just born as they arrived. We had COVID, and it was next level. But I'm immensely proud of the job we did, and so welcoming of those Afghanis who came to Australia then. We might get some really good first-class women cricketers out of it too.
Absolutely, yeah, 100%. You must, extraordinary stuff there, but you must face, for want of a better term, but you must just face 50-50 decisions a lot of the time in terms of anything, crisis or detainees or any international incident. And in your case, a 50-50 decision, dominoes are going to fall one way or another. There'd be, I'm sure, incidents where you go, well, I just want to fix this and I do this, but someone says to you, well, you do this and these 10 things are going to happen. Is that difficult to grapple with, particularly the human element of that?
No question. It absolutely is. And I've had 2 jobs in which 50-50 decisions can be life and death decisions. That weighs heavily. Not everyone. I don't mean that every decision like that is life and death, but it certainly weighs heavily. Some of them are heartbreaking in terms of what you have to do, like stopping the evacuation, finishing it. When you think of the people that are left, particularly the girls and the women,
sure.
For me, that was deeply, deeply felt. And then there are 50-50 decisions that you have to make after great international consultation. And we belong to a number of small mini-lateral groupings, if you like, the Five Eyes intelligence grouping, Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, the United States and Canada, the Quad, Australia, the United States, Japan and India. Sometimes countries will make a decision as part of those groupings that is not welcomed by others. And your job, in my case, is to explain that, to work that through. I remember talking to the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, about a decision we made in relation to Afghanistan. And I can't really go into the details, but he was incredulous that we were making the particular decision. And I told him about the advice that I had been given as a minister. And he paused. And he ultimately said, as a very experienced official, and he is still the National Security Advisor today, he paused and he said, if that's the advice you've got no choice. And I was ready for the fight, but grateful for the understanding, if you like. And it's hard to fight with your great and powerful friends. You don't want to do that, or hard to differ. And you don't want to do that, but you always want to stand your ground. I reread a piece recently because I was writing a speech for something where Matthew Knott from the Herald had commented that I had stood up to then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in Washington. And I didn't remember reading the piece the first time. And Matthew Knott was somewhat incredulous, or the journalist was somewhat incredulous at the way I had done that. But in my mind, I was always just speaking on Australia's behalf and saying what Australia needed to say in our own words, from our own perspective, based on our values, to protect our national security and to protect our national interests. That's my job.
And of course, a lot of these stories continue to bubble away once they leave the public space. So Russia-Ukraine is probably a good example of that in terms of when obviously everything exploded a couple of years ago. This was leading our 6 o'clock news bulletins every night. It's on the front page of papers in Sydney. But it doesn't take long for that to go after the first break in the news bulletin, and then eventually out of the news bulletin. But the issue remains, and the war remains ongoing. So, you're dealing with a lot of issues that the general public potentially has forgotten long about.
Yes, that is absolutely true. And I thought that recently, actually, when I was watching Ukrainian President Zelensky speak in Washington on the media reports. I thought that, he really has had to amp up his advocacy, because that first news bulletin item, that front page item, is currently about Israel and Gaza. Ukraine is on page 3 now. And that's a huge problem for him. He needs the ammunition. He needs the support. I'm a strong advocate of Australia continuing to support Ukraine in their fight for their democracy, very much because if we don't, what is the alternative? There but for the grace of God, as my grandmother would have said, go we. Not necessarily we Australia, but other Western democracies that have fought long and hard for their democratic values and their position. So I'm a very strong supporter of that. But you're right, it does go out of the media, but it doesn't go out of your work. So while we were dealing with Ukraine, we were still dealing with issues between Australia and ASEANs and China in the South China Sea. We're still dealing with challenges in the Pacific. We're still dealing with all of the other things all those other balls that you're juggling at the same time. They're still there. They don't go anywhere. Your juggling continues.
Yeah, absolutely. But back to the local political world, and of course, Coalition wins government in 2019. It's ironic, I guess, you mentioned before that, well, you think you're going to lose, but you've got to remain confident. Well, the best example of that would be 2019, where every poll suggested that Scott Morrison was not going to win the election. But in 2022, the polls get it right. Coalition loses government. You decide to stay on for a little bit longer in the Senate, but all good things must come to an end. And your decision to retire, when did you make that decision, and why did you make it?
I think that's another really good question, Troy. That's why you're the journalist and I'm answering the questions. I decided to stay to support Peter Dutton and his leadership. I saw what opposition was like after 2007, and I didn't very much enjoy it. And I think the period of stability that we've seen in the coalition since 2022 is very telling. It's a very different environment. I've known Peter for 20 years or more now. It's a long time to have worked together. And he made me his Shadow Cabinet Secretary, which was basically running that Shadow Cabinet process, including for people who'd never ever sat around the outer ministry table and were suddenly Shadow Cabinet members. So putting all of that together and making sure that that system ran well, I wanted that to happen before I left. As to when I actually made the decision, it's hard to pinpoint a time. I know there was one thing last year that I really, really wanted to do while I was still in the Senate, and that was my appointment as the ship's sponsor of a United States Navy vessel, the USS Canberra. It was commissioned here in Sydney. We commission our own ships here, of course. Of course we do, and I've done many. But the US has never commissioned a new ship outside continental United States before. So the USS Canberra has amazing history in its name, related to the World War II vessel and related to the US and Australia's engagement in the Solomon Islands. It is something that is an honour I never envisaged receiving. So it's pretty special. They tell me I'm a permanent part of the ship's crew. And that's great. And I'm hoping to go and see them in San Diego in a couple of months' time, which will be very exciting. So I wanted to do that. And then after that, it was, for me, a time of my own making. So I chose that. I chose September 30. It turned out to be an even number, 9,670 days. Wow. But I didn't know that was going to happen. That was serendipity. And I got to make a valedictory speech. I said early in that speech that one thing I hadn't managed to get rid of or excise during my political career was my emotional gene. And it was sad to say goodbye, but I was ready and I'm comfortable with that decision.
Was there some relief attached when the daily press briefings aren't coming through and all of that sort of stuff?
I don't mind. I don't mind that so much, but there is a lot of relief in not going back and forth to Canberra. It's a long time to be going back and forth to Canberra, and so there's that. The thing I really, really miss, and your listeners might laugh because I'm about to say I'm a politician and I really, really, really miss my friends.
Yeah.
Because they say if you want a friend in politics, get a dog, right? I don't agree with that. I have some really, really dear and special friends that I miss a lot.
You're, of course, living in the Penrith area, and Stuart tells me the garden's looking superb since you both exited the political world. But what's next? Because you've made it very clear on a number of times, you're retiring from politics, you're not retiring.
Yes.
So what's next? I know you have picked up a role with Western Sydney University, of course.
Yes, so I'm enjoying that. I'm a Vice-Chancellor's Fellow invited to do that by the current Vice-Chancellor, Barney Glover, and that has made me a Professor of Practice in International Relations and Public Policy.
Okay.
I find that quite amusing. I'd never thought of myself as an academic or a professor, but I'm really enjoying that. And look, Western Sydney is a powerhouse, and I don't use that word lightly. If you think about how they've transformed their campuses and our communities, literally from the Hawkesbury to Liverpool, it's pretty impressive. And Barney Glover's been responsible for a great deal of that, following Janice Reid's role as VC. So I'm doing that, and excited about that. Excited about their engagement in India and in Vietnam and Indonesia as well. I've also been appointed at the invitation of former US Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice as a distinguished visiting fellow at a very long-standing US think tank called the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in California. I've been back and forth to Stanford a couple of times now, and that is a chance to be with some of the greatest minds in foreign policy, economic policy, defence policy in the world, and certainly in the United States, and I'm very excited about that. And then the rest is a work in progress. But you're dead right, I am not retired.
No, very good indeed. Now, we talked about before about the line of trailblazing women, which has sort of been attached to you along the way, being the first, the longest serving, obviously, female senator and first woman Young Liberals president, and the list goes on. We do hear often, well, the Liberal Party's got a woman problem, so to speak, in terms of representation and whatnot. Did you see that in your time there, particularly in recent times, and where do you think it's at, and what needs to be done to make improvements, if there are improvements to be made?
I think that's a really difficult difficult question in some ways. Do we have enough women in elected positions in the Liberal Party at federal level? No. No, we don't. And the more that I can encourage women to stand, to get involved in the political process, I will do that with every breath I have, every day of the week. And not just, frankly, in the Liberal Party, to be honest. I encourage their participation broadly. But for us, it's immensely important. We have increased the numbers at the state level in New South Wales, and I can acknowledge the leadership that has led to that, whether it's from former premiers and the current leader, Mark Speakman. I acknowledge that. But there is more to do. And, Troy, it actually has to be a whole of party effort. I think one of the things I find most frustrating is those members of the party who regard it as for the women of the Liberal Party to address. That's just ridiculous. And it doesn't even work mathematically. You need the whole party to address it. And so I think, Peter Dutton is committed to that, but we are a democratic party. So it is also something that requires cultural change. There are people who make their decisions about who they choose as candidates on a whole range of issues, but, in all walks of life, in and out of politics, I have met people who have said to my face that they don't think I'm suitable for the job I'm doing because I am a woman. Now, that's a little galling after 26 and a half years in Parliament, where I, just kind of managed to survive, right? And people still say that in 2024, that, it's not the right job for you, dear. Well, I'm sorry, they're wrong. Yeah. So more of that. The theme for International Women's Day a week ago was invest in women, count her in, invest in women, accelerate progress. For us, we must, as a party, accelerate progress, and I keep working on that. It's not as good as I want it to be, and I will do more.
Well, there's no question that you're someone to look up to for any women looking to get involved in politics, but anyone sort of fighting that fight at the moment. An extraordinary career. We could talk for a lot longer, but the last question we do always ask, how would Marise Payne like to be remembered?
Well, I'm not dead, so I'm not sure. I think I'd like to be remembered as someone who has made a contribution in my political career, someone who's made a contribution to our nation, who has contributed loyally and enthusiastically, with diligence and with integrity over a long period of time. I didn't set out to stay there that long. It worked out that way, but I do think that I can be proud of the things that I did change, and certainly there are certainly some landmark areas that I could point to. So if I'm remembered, as I said in that first phrase there, in those terms, I will be comfortable for that recollection of my political career.
No question about that, I don't think. All right, well, Marise, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it, and for telling us your story.
Thank you, Troy.
And I hope you enjoyed our chat. On the Record is produced by The Western Weekender. To hear future episodes, search Western Weekender wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you hit subscribe. Check out westernweekender.com.au, and we will see you next time.